Jam listeners, I'm Nicole, back with another episode of Builder's Journey on the Club Pod. For this episode of Builder's Journey, I spoke with Malcolm Levy, co-founder of Refraction, a community of diverse artists and culture builders creating an IRL and digital festival and spaces worldwide. Malcolm and I got into the values and culture being created at Refraction and how these show up in their Metaverse and IRL events. We discussed the formation of the initial core team and how they go about selecting the tech tools at work in the Refraction DAO. Malcolm, what's up?
Hi, how are you, Nicole?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm great. I'm great.
I'm really excited to hang out with you and talk Builder's Journey and just learn a little bit about Refraction. One of the things that I have a really fun time with is people that I think I know and projects that I think I know. I get to actually learn a bunch of new things in these podcasts as well. So I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Amazing. Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you. So let's start out. Can you tell me who you are and can you tell me a little bit about Refraction?
Sure. My name's Malcolm Levy, and I'm a curator and artist and organizer that's been involved in the art and technology and music and culture space for the past around 20 years or so. I started building underground electronic music and arts festivals when I was about 20 years old or so, quite young, and helped to build a festival called New Forms Festival. I was one of the founders, which was one of the early art and music and technology festivals in the world at the time. And then from there, in 2010, I was still working on the festival, and I got asked to curate the first digital arts festival for an Olympics, which was a huge shift in experience for me. And after that, a bunch of different folks started asking me if I wanted to do different projects more in the startup space. And after going back to school to do my master's at the New School, I ended up at New Inc. at the New Museum, the incubator there, which was probably the start of my journey into where I am today. Kind of taking a lot of what I had been doing for all of those years and bring them into kind of what is today Web3. A lot of the folks there are now involved in some of the more interesting projects in Web3 as well. You know, Kevin McCoy was minting the first NFT when we were there. It was a very interesting time. And I think in the concept of like the creative incubation of ideas, Web3 has a lot of resonance. So I retired. I was on the board of New Forms, passing it on to the next generation, which it now is, and it's very humbling to see that happen. And further than that, I started creative startups. Generate was the main one, in working, on a creative app in the space and partnering with a lot of bigger Web 2 platforms at the time, and companies like Adobe and Facebook got me really understanding like how kind of Web 2 worked. And, to be honest, a lot of what I saw or a lot of what I learned were things that I didn't really invariably agree with when it came to like how artists and creators and creatives were treated. And so, then came along till now, really. So, what ended up happening was during the pandemic, a lot of folks were asking if I was going to do another festival, having retired from New Forms and moving on. And we curated this festival called Refraction. And it was all online, all over the world. It was a decentralized festival, almost in advance of, DAOs to a large extent. I mean, if I look historically, there were probably a couple DAOs at that time, 3 years ago or so, but we, did a decentralized festival, and then we're fortunate enough to join Seed Club and really build it out into a DAO, which was something I was so excited about, both because of my experience over the 20 years of nonprofit work and so on, but also understanding kind of more incubation and startups and that entire world over kind of the last 10 years of that. So as that was happening, I talked to two really good friends, Greg Liebert, who I had known for about 20 years and was the started community at Nike Air Jordan and a brilliant mind, and Raf Kettigback, who had been the editor and creative director at Vice. And I asked them if they wanted to come along for this journey, and both of them were really excited and said yes. And so then we started building out Refraction as it stands today as a official DAO, in Web3 with an incredible community and a festival starting in March that will go, throughout the world and then eventually travel into the metaverse and really becoming a concept for a larger platform, a larger community, and different initiatives that we kind of do year round all over the world, both IRL and in the metaverse, the open metaverse, I should say.
Yeah. Yeah, wow. So there's a couple of pieces there that I think are really important to sort of bring out. I think that your evolution into the space makes a ton of sense, when you look backwards. And I think that people that want to be in your shoes, people that are looking to your story and others like it, it can be daunting to understand how you go through this and then, eventually end up in a place like Refraction or like Krause House or Eve Wealth, etc. So it's really helpful to kind of see those breadcrumbs laid out of, this is how you took these various experiences. And, now in hindsight, it's a clear path. But I'm sure, when you were in New Ink, certainly it sounds like you sensed something. There was a vibe, there was a feeling in the room and in those networks and communities that there was something better, that we could build something better. But, it was probably not as clear as where you are now. I think my next question is around the team, because knowing that you didn't 100% know where you might be going and, what this would turn into, how did you think about your team members? And how did you think about bringing these people on? Because one of the things that really strikes me with Refraction is how you have these 3 team members that are incredibly committed to your goal and mission, and you all are very clear on where Refraction is going. There's no, sort of disparate opinions there, and yet your skill sets are fairly fragmented. And so, mission clear, skill sets complementary, and not a ton of overlay. And I'm really curious about how you brought your team together and how you thought about working together, because I think that what I see and what you 3 have built really speaks to what a successful leadership team in a DAO can and should look like.
Yeah, I mean, I should say that focus and clarity on vision is a constant. It's a constant situation. It's not something that happens one day or is ever finished. So you're continually refining as emergent concepts come out of the DAO, but also making sure that you're doing what your community expected when they came in to begin with, and everything else in between. And so when I was thinking about the DAO as a whole, I knew that community was going to be incredibly important to that. And I knew that how we editorialized that and looked at kind of partnerships and creative direction would be incredibly important. And one thing I've learned over the last many years is like what I'm good at and what I'm not good at. And so, I knew that I would have no problems curating with an incredible group. And I'll talk a little bit about how we've built out the guilds and the team since then. But, and how we would work with artists and so on and so forth. But, how you build a community and how you conceptualize that as an art form in itself, and how you create a new model of editorial and writing and partnerships and activations and so on also is. And, to have something like a Refraction be successful, you really need all of them, right? And so, it was quite simply that these were 2 people. It was first Greg, and then I think part of in working with Greg to start the first, say, month or 2, we realized then what we still needed, And then Raf made a lot of sense to fill in those gaps, And to be honest, it's very interesting because at each stage you talk about a bunch of things and then you figure out more. And so it became clear, at least from a meta level, this made sense. And then what happened after that is that as we started opening up the community, there was so right around November, right around, yeah, early November, late October, it was the weekend of NFT NYC, or that week of NFT NYC, and we're still in Seed Club. And as you remember, there was this famous moment during the summer where Greg, minted the token, and everyone in Seed Club was, chanting mint because Greg would otherwise take way too long to do anything, and he finally did it. And then, the three of us got together and, got it into our safe and figured it all out. And at that time, what was really cool is like we did this mirror post, and we took like a long time writing this mirror post. And the mirror post really had a lot to do with like what we were thinking about as a festival, and how the festival, was part of a larger framework. But most importantly, like what our ethics were, like where we came from, what we believed, like over 20 years of like building emergent and avant-garde culture, you end up to a large extent being involved in like every trend that blows up. Not every single trend, but a lot of them, or people who are part of the other ones. And in Web 2, that just became this like very vicious cycle of like creating ideas that would then get stolen from you. And so I think that like all of us in different ways were quite jaded from that experience, and also had enough perspective to not be like angry about that anymore, or but instead be like, well, this seems like a new way to do it that would make a ton of sense. And also have a lot of care to like a community that we're part of, And when I say community we're part of, I'm not just talking about Refraction. I'm just talking about the larger community worldwide, And it was invariably like my belief, and I know with Raf and Greg, that if we don't get in front of this, then who knows where it can go. And I talked to a lot of other folks in Web3 about the exact same thing. And I think right now you have these different ideologies, fighting for the soul of Web3, or maybe they'll just be different, different verticals that it goes in, so to speak. So you're going to have, you have different kinds of DAOs. You have DeFi DAOs. You've got DAOs that are, sometimes related to an NFT or a drop or a specific type of, shitcoin or whatever it might be, or, something like that, but maybe they're hiding art within DeFi or something like this kind of thing. And then you have the culture DAOs that are all starting, and a lot of the Seed Club DAOs are kind of like the culture DAOs, so whether it's a culture of creating a basketball team or building a city or doing a festival, or, rewriting how the music industry functions, or anything else in between, it's, they're cultural in essence, regardless of whether they go from there. There's a specific kind of way that they're being thought of in terms of community. And so what happened with us is like, we did this post and it really talked about what we believed in. And, before that, I'd been kind of fortunate in Web3. I just started minting on Foundation and joining Seed Club, and people were buying my art, and Seed Club was interesting with incredible folks. So I was just like, oh, I guess this is Web3. And what I didn't realize really, and I kind of half realized, but I was so in my own little bubble of Web3, and being like within like the maelstrom of activity at an NFT NYC, you start to see like, oh, all this other stuff happening, right? And all these other kind of worlds. And as this was happening IRL in the metaverse, people were joining Refraction by the minute and by the hour, based on this post. And the people who were joining were like the most incredible folks. Like, so, we'd already talked to founding artists and partners, but even people we hadn't had a chance to reach out to yet were just joining. So they're like, oh, wow, like this is cool. Like we didn't expect it to happen so fast, So immediately we realized two things. Like number one, like not only we were talking about specific roles in building a community, but we were also speaking about like specific like ethics or like morals or like just a framework of like how to think about the world in Web3 that people were like wanting to be part of. So then we had to basically create, a membership and kind of gate the Discord, not because we were trying to be elitist, like you still get in no matter what right now. And we're going to move to a slightly different system over the next few weeks where it will be token enabled, but within a framework where as long as you're like, doing work that makes sense for the DAO, you can get in. But because we needed to make sure we kept like lurkers out, because all of a sudden we had this like very, very, very incredible community that was born almost overnight. And we knew if we didn't do that, it could get muddy. And we wanted to make sure that like every single person that joined took the time to explain why they wanted to join and who they were and why they were joining and who told them, or if they found it through a post or they found it somewhere else. Totally cool. But we wanted to have like intentionality around that. So then as this group came in, we did one-on-one interviews with everyone. And we started building out, before even our team internally in all of our guilds, we started building out like what this community was and who they were. And then from that, we started putting together the guilds. So the guilds, as we've started them, were all like intentionally created based on our discussions with everyone in the DAO. And so when we started to build out guilds, and through those guilds, we started to build out, really this year's festival. And one thing that's really interesting to note, or two things, is like I'm just finalizing a mirror post that is basically a decentralized conceptual framework for curation, and at the same time working with Sherry Hugh on like an article about kind of how you can think about that from an editorial perspective and a curatorial perspective and everything else in between. And then further to that, really thinking about how we integrate everyone in the DAO into the festival. And so I bring that up because, as the festival being kind of this metaphor for the community, making sure like, it takes that village to create the festival. So, emergent groups like health and wellness, creative tech, music tech have all become part of DAO to DAO activity, have all become part of like this year's festival, because those were emergent guilds that were coming up through Refraction. And by incorporating them in, you have like a holistic view of what the DAO is and also what people are doing in it. So at the same time, we have like very pragmatic roles like the Metaverse team or the curatorial team or the production team or the technical team, IRL team, etc. And, design team, marketing and sponsorship partnerships, communications, whatever you want to, So what's really interesting is like, in terms of our build, it was very much a mix of the intentionality of the community we were creating and like the structure with like these emergent community, forms that came out of it. And so it's been this really interesting process of letting that grow while also, as you said, like earlier on, making sure like the vision is clear, because like you can easily get caught up in something and do a million different things. But, for us, it's using that metaphor as a festival to do more and more continuously post this year's festival. But if that festival isn't figured out in a way, doesn't have to be massive, doesn't have to like have millions of people there, it just has to be clear and everyone has to understand roles and we have to learn from it. And we will do it to a level that will make sense and be really good and stylish and beautiful and interesting and break new waves in different ways and all of that. That is like the least of my concerns, in the sense that we have such a good team in and around it all and everyone's pushing for the same kind of goal around that. But like, you also have to allow this emergence, and then figure out, okay, this is what happens. So now when we do a big festival in IRL, these are the lessons we learned, and this is what our community said, and this is what the audience said, and this would make more sense for an audience going further. And we noticed this in people, bridging from Web 2 to Web 3, and all the other things that are going to come from that,
Yeah. Yeah, I think that it has been really interesting to watch the team's evolution and the project's evolution. And, what I see is that you three all pull really deeply from, like you said, being in movements and, avant garde, underground culture. Having watched, my husband comes from like skater and hardcore and sort of that similar DJ culture and a lot of those sort of, underground niches. There's such a level of trust and relationship. And I think that when you're pulling from those, I think that that's one of the things that is very clear within your community, where you see these sort of deep rooted understandings of, support and mutual respect and coming through these times where, like you said, culture and trends were emerging, and we see that now in popular culture, and we see that in fashion and music and movies, film, whatever. But knowing how real and hard those lifestyles were for artists at that time, and so I think that bringing that now into the work that you all do, you see that sort of authenticity reflected in how you let the emergence happen, but also coming from these really deeply understood values. I'm curious to explore these values and culture a little bit more because, clearly the culture of underground music and, digital art and these various places that each of you are coming from shows up in the way that you build your community. I've been seeing a lot of interesting dialogue about the metaverse / pluriverse and what that space is going to be. And obviously, with the introduction of Meta and Microsoft and all of these conglomerates going into the metaverse, I think that there's this protection that we're now feeling around what the metaverse is going to mean to us. And so, what are the really intentional ways? I'm curious, in practice, not sort of the theory of it, which I think that we get, but what are the ways in practice that you're thinking about how you build your pluriverse or metaversal experiences that tie back to, again, those, values and ethics that came from being at, in the underground when it was truly underground? How do those cultures
Sure.
and values show up?
Well, like there's a joke that one of my good friends often says about me, which is that, I haven't really changed for the last 10 years, just like my hoodies. And so, or the last 20 years, right? So it's you know, like you hit a certain point in life where you don't really change a lot of like how you think about things because you've been kind of told you're wrong so many times that you just want to prove you're right. So you know, I remember very clearly, you know, conversations with folks about everything from, you know, um, pushing more, diversity to uplifting marginalized communities to LGBTQ plus issues to, um, Me Too issues and being, allying with folks that, were trying at many, many stages of that to like move these forward. Okay. And I remember also at the same time being involved in firmly believing that underground culture was just the most interesting culture and the most real culture, musically, artistically, culturally, from an activist perspective, etc. Um, and it's like something like once you're sort of part of, it's very hard to shake it, you know? And I think a lot of us had a lot of difficulty with aspects of Web 2 because um, we were kind of used, right? So if you're throwing the cool party on Facebook and you've got 5,000 people attending, and then you're paying advertising on top of that, and then they're using the 5,000 people who are attending to sell advertising to other people, and you don't actually get anything from that at the end, but like people coming to your event, most who would probably already come anyhow. And then you're creating further content in terms of posts and other things that happen on the site or live streams, etc. at some point you start to realize like the predatory nature of that overall, but also that you like have to create something new. So like what I've always said is like the early DIY cultures are very similar to Web3 today. Whether it's like the pluriverse, like, rave culture or DIY punk culture or the industrial culture or the indie scene, um, it all comes from the same place in early hip hop, you know, all electronic music in that sense, whether coming from Detroit and Chicago, New York or Berlin, or anywhere in between, so much of that culture, the first time, like, I was lucky in a sense because like a lot of parties I went to when I was young were with a huge different group of people, whether it was like, I started raving when I was like 15, 16 years old at like big raves in like 95, 90, that era, right? And then going to like really cool little house parties at that time and jungle parties and, hip hop shows and everything in between, so it's like you start to understand culture in a different way because you're part of this like DIY growth, but also like a lot of really cool different communities are part of that, right? So I think in a way like that start of Web3 actually was then, or it could be, with Woodstock in the 60s or, you know, early jazz movements in the, in the 30s or something like that, you can kind of trace Web3 through like cultural connections and people trying to create their own scenes through history. Um, so I think like as it comes to today, that that feeling, those kind of like tenants are like super important still, right? So like a lot of the people within the community, you're creating a community around what the community kind of wants or kind of believes in. So like one of the tenants we do is we're gonna give like a certain amount to charity of everything we do to different groups like in the space, whether it's like smaller DAOs or activist groups, trying to uplift different communities. You know, um, the way we curate, the way we've created our curatorial framework, we're very clear about what our values are. Like one of the reasons we created the little membership form was so that if you're coming in and you didn't agree with specific principles about what type of world we really wanted to create, then you don't have to join. No one's making you. And like, you do these things intentionally so that you can hopefully create a space that's more equitable, but also, just like has the certain, conceptual framework and vibes that we want. And I think like, and further to that, one thing we've really noticed as we've like been on Discord and the rest is that, a lot of folks don't want that. They're like not, they want to just get emails or a text or a good old fashioned, Google Meetup or whatever it might be, or meet somewhere in the metaverse. Who knows? There's like lots of opportunities. And we have a saying around refraction was we like to meet folks where they're at. And so, we're really working on creating frameworks and creating ways that people can do that. And, I'd say our community is thankful for that or happy about that, because, many of them are just like, can we just use, this or that or the other for specific aspects of organization or discourse or what have you. One of the biggest things about our, newsletter and publication and editorial side as we start to roll it out is having it, really interesting in sense of like how we consider that and how all of that comes out, but also at the same time, just quite simply like communicating with everyone so everyone knows what's going on. Because like trying to follow in the Discord is fairly difficult to do
Yeah, it
based
can be
on, the
challenging.
number of Discords. It's challenging because everyone's fighting for your attention from one Discord to another.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that the, you know, description of that DIY and the roots that you have definitely shows up in how I see you building. And I remember when we met in person and you referenced the four initials, PLUR, and, bringing that into, I think that, a lot of what you we're naming of, and a lot of what I think creatives have experienced that were around in the 90s and the early 2000s of being the weirdos and finding your other weirdos and finding the other people that you feel comfortable being yourself with and, being in those spaces. I think that what excites me about what y'all are building in Refraction is that feeling again of, going into a room, whether it's the metaverse or whether it's a Discord or whether it's an actual party, and seeing again all of those weirdos and freaks that you feel comfortable with and finding, your people and your community that you can then be in community with and enjoy, the wonderful, weird things that we've created together. And like you said, that's where ultimately you see the big trends come out of. And so I think the promise of communities like Refraction capturing that value in a different new way, where it's not then, the companies profiting from it, but it's the communities is really exciting. I want to pivot a little bit to talk about the technology that goes underneath this, because I think that, clearly what y'all are doing is heavy on the community side and you have a lot of strengths there, but you've also had to, as you mentioned, you've had to be thinking about meeting people where they're at. And so thinking about the different ways that Web3 tools now allow us to do that, because you've been building community, like you said, for decades. You've been throwing these events and building cultures around these events and experiences for decades. The piece that's new are the, superpowers that tokens unlock. And so I would love for you to just share a little bit about, and I do remember that. I do remember when you were driving when y'all minted the token, right? I think you were driving home or something like that, and we were chanting mint, 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 and Greg minted the token and it was there. So I think you got past that first hurdle of just the token exists. It's in a wallet that you had created specifically for Refraction. But now that a few months have passed, how are you thinking about the tech utility within Refraction? And how are you thinking intentionally about how it sort of maps onto those very specific and deliberate ethical choices that you've made?
Right. Okay. So there's like a bunch of different tech now that we use. So again, I would go back to start with that analogy. And the first person who said this to me in the space was Rayhan from Friends with Benefits, who's such an incredible person to say the least. And we were talking one day, and he's like, you're not going to have any problems figuring this out eventually because you've been doing events and festivals for so long, and all of this is basically like that, regardless of Refraction actually also working within that metaphorical structure. And once you start, like, I've been lucky to learn technologies for a long time on a lot of little different levels. So I have a unique ability to figure them out fairly quickly and then figure out how they relate to, the UX and UI of a specific project or product, whatever you are working on. So obviously, so let's just say like the beyond discords for us is we're using a technology called Clarity, which is like a notion for Web3 where it gives token gated access for our community for everything from jobs to everyone in the community to updates to listings to all these different aspects. We're building an Airtable that will basically manage all these aspects of the community. We are using our Gnosis Safe and now Utopia in order to do, drops in tokens and USDC to different members of the community. Our first airdrop did something where we did a multi-send to the entire community, making sure we paid all the gas fees. We felt that was very important from an ethical standpoint, not to make anyone pay upon their initial, coming into Refraction and becoming a member. When we did that, we did it at 4:50 in the morning because gas fees were very low. So it was only about $7 a member to send it to them at that time of night, which was pretty wild in the grand scheme of things. So we use our Gnosis, like say if we have a couple Web3 devs on the team that work with me on that. We're building different platforms for minting. We're conceptualizing a lot of different ways that we're going to see Web3 play out. From an editorial standpoint, we're going to have a Web3 publication that's going to come out. We're going to have a Web3 media side around, mixes and video and areas like that that are related to the events and the festival. We're going to have an art platform that's related to all the NFTs and art that is happening. And those would be like kind of like the main technologies we're either building or working with. But I would say like what we do is we kind of look at what the community needs or what we need. So for instance, when we do launch the metaverse side of the festival, which will happen not directly after the festival, but a few months later with a lot of work put in, we're going to do it in a few metaverses, in a few of the open metaverses, not in one. So you might go to an exhibition here and an event over there and a conference talk over here, and look at what makes sense of all of them. Both because it's kind of more interesting. It's like being in a festival in a city and going to different locations in a sense, but also because how they make most sense, Some
Yeah.
are better for others for a million different reasons, from the graphics, the community, to some you can see each other and some you cannot, to how many people can be in them. There's a
Yeah.
million different reasons, and that's incredibly important to us and really interesting.
And so, when you encounter these tools or when you're bringing something in, and I want to understand a little bit more too, you were talking about some of the changes coming up in your Discord. How do you ultimately decide what you're going to sort of take out of the box versus when it makes sense to make something yourself? Because I think, especially with how quickly tools come online in Web3, one thing that I've personally experienced is you think you need something custom. While you're exploring that, you see a few weeks later or a month later, the solution that you were in the process of building for yourself come online by someone else as well. So how have you been making those
Totally.
decisions and sort of playing with that tension?
Yeah, I mean that's great. Like that's a great question. So like for instance, with Discord, there's a thing called Newsroom, which is like a front page to Discord that we're going to use. So basically it means when you come to the Discord, you're going to see everything going on in the DAO, basically. So maybe you're someone who's busy or doesn't like to be on Discord or only has 10 minutes. You can just browse through it all there before coming in, just to understand what's going on. A lot of these other concepts, like having a larger editorial that goes outside, having IRL meetups, having DAO to DAO meetups, having a lot of these things that kind of like speak to that emergence, like really are things that like we try to do outside of the box. Like I would say that our product is more thinking about the community in that sense and like what we're building and then how we can build more and more events and partner with more spaces around the world and partner with other DAOs and figure out really interesting frameworks around that. And then use specific technologies coming in to do that, I would say more, or abstract different technologies in ways that make sense for us and different tools. So, I think that that's like really interesting and like what we'll see, and there's, it's interesting because I think some of the DAOs really focus on creating, new stuff all the time and, maybe a new piece of technology. And as you say, that solves a real problem for them and, often for others. And, what's interesting is right now, there's a lot of DAOs offering us specific technology to try, whether it be a specific type of NFT or a specific way for, DAOs to work with other DAOs or a specific way to organize some aspect of your community or a specific way to do announcements or any of these things. And you know, I think you're right that so many folks are working on the tools. Like if you look at like what's been supported in Web3, so much of it is new tooling, right? So there's this massive amount of new tooling, and you also have all these open source frameworks that people can build new tooling around. So it's like, it's not that hard to build new tools, and a lot of it becomes something that's more focused on like the UI and UX of the tool than like the actual functionality of the tool, because a lot of the tools are very similar in terms of what they do. So, I would say like we look more at product as something that we'll use other products in ways we want to do it in slightly differently. And then if we figure out specific aspects that would be emergent to us, like a platform that is artist run, that like makes sense for our community, but also makes sense on a larger level because it's a problem that needs to be solved, right? Problem invariantly being that like if I bid on a piece of art or any of my friends that are artists, it will always get outbid. And you can watch this conversation on Twitter every day of the week. Why? Well, because collectors are smart and they want to follow what the artists are doing. It's kind of like the story I was just telling over the last, 30 minutes, right? So it's like, okay, well, now with Web3, we can do this a little differently. And we can even invite collectors into that platform. This isn't about anyone, having more or less say around that. But what it is about is making it work within a user experience that makes sense to our community. And so like I've become very, 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 very like a very big believer in like UX for community and also like listening to our community and relating it back to what we're doing. So I almost think of the whole festival like this product that different things can happen out of, or this like platform or whatever you want to call it, this community, this village, whatever it is, but that then you can take those pieces to create new things out of them. The more that they integrate together, the more that they can then create their own. And then we have, like other DAOs or emergent DAOs that are coming out or partnering and all these things. And we want to figure out how all that works. So for us, it's a lot about like the tools that can make that happen. And then like, how do we abstract those tools for specifically what we want?
Yeah, I mean, that excites me also because having done some product development within community and seeing the power of doing that hand in glove with artists and creatives, I think is incredibly exciting. And then knowing that through the token and through community ownership, the people that participated in that can then share in the upside, I think is even more exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. So like the biggest tool to use is the fact that you have tokens for your community, right? And so for us, that's just like a given because we believe so much in that. So like if there was one to conclude on outside of like any product or tool, it's really the fact that in Web3, you can give tokens to your community and you can basically decide that. And no one can tell you not to. And people can support you or not, but like you can make all those decisions and you can uplift all of your community members in a way that like never has happened before. Like in a nonprofit, everyone kind of shares in it while they're there. And then when you leave, the nonprofit just continues and there's a new board and a new structure and anything can happen.
Yeah.
Wild things can happen. You have no control of that. And it's like, can go in whatever direction, right? And like, there are no tokens for the hundreds and hundreds and thousands of hours that in labor that you might have put into that. None, right? In a corporate infrastructure, you could have a great idea and maybe you get something out of it, but your idea is completely shifted and usurped and there's no community around it of where it started. You hear that story a million times. The startup started like this, then it went in that direction after 4 years or 5 years or whatever, and so came in and so left or whatever. In a DAO, it's incredibly different because you have this like potential possibility of, regardless of all the examples I just had, the work that people did at those different moments gets rewarded. And so why I think that's so important and maybe like a really interesting place to conclude on around this whole idea of like DIY and avant-garde and starting from the underground, bringing it up is like, this is the first time where all of those folks, that entire community is the community that's there at the beginning, getting rewarded before anyone else comes along and takes it. And that's like really cool because it kind of like creates this total reverse structure than that's ever happened before. And that's the Web3 I believe in, and that's why I came to Web3 because I was like, yeah, that would be really cool. And people can say whatever they want about all these other things and all this degen stuff and all this other stuff. And that's cool. And that's fine. And, totally like, it's not untrue. A lot of those things, it's a very early stage with all these things, but there is this movement in Web3 around actually doing what I'm talking about. And that's the Web3 I believe in and like where I want to see it go. And like where it would actually be powerful on a, global level, in a cultural level and beyond.
Yeah. I mean, I think that this is where the revolution that a lot of us on the ground are seeing. All right. Well, I guess last question, two-part. Anything exciting coming up specifically with Refraction that we should know about in the coming weeks? And then where can we find you and Refraction so that we can follow these things?
Totally. So the two really exciting things coming up, we're doing our NFT drop in a couple of weeks with some incredible artists from around the world, a bunch of legends, and we're going to be announcing that and who the artists are in the next week. It's going to give not only incredible artwork, but also like a huge amount of utilities into Refraction, which I'm so excited about on so many levels. And then we're going to be announcing our initial lineup for this year's festival, and the festival launches in March. With regard to where you can see all of this and participate and become involved or support from, refractionfestival.com, as well as in the Discord, which you can just find at Refraction. Our Twitter, which is Refraction DAO. I'm at Mal Levy. And you can reach out to us at any of those places. We're always around, and we're always down for a conversation.
Amazing. Well, thank you. Thank you. Y'all are some of my favorite builders and favorite people to party and hang with in Web3. So it was really fun getting to know you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Nicole. We appreciate you so much, and Jess and the whole team at Seed Club.